since I was late.
Well, welcome. I'm really delighted to be here today with Angela Yuriko Smith, editor of Space and Time magazine. Welcome, Angela. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. This is a privilege and a thrill. I'm so glad to be here.
My pleasure. And everybody else, welcome. If you have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat and I will work them into the conversation. So, Angela, you're actually the second sci-fi lit mag editor that I've interviewed, and I'm very excited to be sort of branching out into the kind of genre magazine. So, this is great. So,
Thank
thanks for
you.
being
Thank you.
here. And why don't you tell us about the history of your magazine and when you came on board?
Okay. Yeah, and also let thank you for letting a genre magazine slum around with the lit mags because we're called lit sci-fi, but I'm always like, is that a thing? I don't know. So we're still figuring it out. But yeah, the magazine has been around since 1966. I wasn't the person who started it. It was Gordon Linsner who started it as a high schooler on a mimeograph machine that they bought for $25.
Yeah.
So the fact that it still survives today from that, like what I don't have anything from high school that's lasted, so I'm always really impressed. And he had so many amazing people. One of the my favorite stories is the singer from Kiss, Gene Simmons, did art for the magazine when he was 13
No
and he still remembers
way.
it. Yeah, so I've screenshotted it and shared it on Twitter back when that was a thing, and he responded with like, "Oh yeah, I remember that," and like some little stories. So like, the magazine has had just this amazing history. Gordon ran it for about 50 years before, as you do, you get really tired of publishing a
Mhm.
magazine. And Hildy Silverman took it over after that, and she held on to it for, I think, about 12 years. And then I came into it because I had had a magazine. I was just working on my writing career with no responsibilities, having a great time. And I decided I needed to expand who I was submitting to. And one of my friends had just been published by this magazine called Space and Time that yeah, I'd heard of it. And so I went over there and looked, and the announcement was that they were closing it. But
Mm.
at the bottom of it, Hildy had this little hook that just would not leave me alone. And it was like, if anybody, because this has been around over 50 years, if anybody feels that they could possibly take this on, would they? Would they save this magazine because it's a piece of history, and all that? And I was like, well, not me. Absolutely not. I'm living my best life as a retired writer. I came from newspaper world. I'm done with deadlines and then it just wouldn't let me go. So I eventually said, yes, yes, I will take it on. And then I was originally just going to do it for a couple years until I could pass it off on somebody else. And then I just fell in love.
Mm.
So I'm here. I'm here until the end, I guess, until my 50 years and I pass it on to somebody else. So, but that's the history of it. We've had all sorts of just amazing names get their start. We publish a lot of first time writers. We're semi pro. And we remain semi pro on purpose because we are here for the newer writers.
Mm.
That's who we're aiming at, is to give these incredibly talented people a chance to get published and get a step up. So
Mhm.
that's basically it.
That's great. So a question here, 50 years, that is incredible. It's remarkable. What explains the longevity, do you think?
I really, and maybe I sound a little bit kooky at this point, but I feel like the magazine has its own soul
Mm.
and it just wants to survive. And so, in spite of everything, like 2020, we almost closed. Like I had it in 2020, and we wound up, and that's when we printed it traditionally with the printer, would buy the run, and then manually ship all the magazines out. It was a hell of a lot of work, but that's how we ran it. And then in 2020, when all the mail started getting lost, I don't know if anybody remembers that nightmare.
Mhm.
We
Oh,
remember
yeah.
it very clearly. And so we weren't really making money on the magazine because it's a labor of love. And so there was always a little bit of out of pocket. And so we had subscribers in Germany and they were paying the same subscription as in the US. Whatever, it's like $10 here, $20 maybe. But then the first shipment of that issue got completely lost. I was actually standing in the line at the post office with my huge giant cart of magazines to mail, as the announcement was coming in that they were going to do an emergency, a call for an emergency or declaration of emergency.
Mm.
And so, I remember standing there going, gee, I guess, would this affect the magazine? I don't think so, because what does a magazine have to do with this tiny little thing that's going to be over in like 2 weeks? Like, so I mailed everything. And then most of that shipment, which was about, a couple of $100s, I think it was about $500 at that time to mail out, disappeared.
Mm.
Like almost nobody got their magazines. Well, that's a hit. So we mailed them out again. And then that one just about disappeared. And that's when we were like, we can't afford to keep doing this. And because it was run by grocery money, basically. And so that was the question of, are we going to close it or not?
Mm.
But that's where I think the magazine's soul kind of kicks in because at the time I really had a lot of conflict with admitting this, and I still do. But we went print on demand at that point, but to survive and pay all the people for the next magazine, because we were already in production for the next issue, as you do, I wound up literally using my grocery money and going to food pantries and getting free food because it was kind of like, yeah, we have the money to buy the groceries, but I
Mm.
don't have the money to buy the groceries at this point and pay the contributors for the next issue. So we can cancel the next issue or delay it, which I hate doing because once you delay something,
Yeah.
it just starts not coming back. Or I could go stand in a food kitchen. And so the whole time I'm there, I felt so guilty because I'm like, people are there because they don't have that choice. And that was my privilege to have that choice,
Hmm.
that I'm choosing to be there because I really want to spend my money somewhere else. So yeah, I felt so guilty and
Mm.
ashamed. And I'm standing in the line to get the food, editing things
Yeah.
on my phone for
Wow.
the next issue. So
Right.
it's just like, oh, I may take a karmic hit for this, but I'm just going to do it because we just felt like it was that important that the magazine survive.
Yeah.
So I can only be the magazine soul in my head, like
Hmm.
uh, overthrowing common sense because that wasn't a common sense decision.
I don't know. I think in some ways it's quite honorable to some degree. Like you're trying to pay your contributors and you're trying to keep the project afloat.
Yeah, I'm glad we did in retrospect, and that's why I well admit it now.
Yeah.
Um, because I mean, the magazine has wound up being so important to so many people, as they're coming out, new writers, getting that first chance to get their voice out there and stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no regrets, a little bit of conflict with guilt and
Yeah.
ethics, I guess.
I definitely understand. So can
Yeah.
you tell, all right, so when I think of space and time, so full disclosure, I'm mostly like my experiences with literary magazines mostly, but I do have a budding interest in science fiction. Like the past year, I've just been diving into it, becoming really curious about it. But when I think of space and time, I think of time travel and I think of like parallel worlds and like the multiverse.
Mhm.
So can you give us a sense of like beyond that? Like what are you seeing in submissions? What other kinds of things do people like to write about? I'm sure it's not all just time travel and parallel world.
Oh, right. Yeah, and it's actually an interesting thing that I've seen is each publisher has had their own flavor. And so with Gordon, it was a lot of sword and sorcery,
Mm.
and a lot of those stories, I feel like we have to put like a little note of we don't. This was written at that time in the 70s. It's a little bit different the things that people thought in the 70s from what we think now. But for historical value, we're keeping them. And then Hildy was very science fiction oriented. So there was a lot of like the hardcore science fiction, the weaponry, the spacecrafts, things like that. And I'm definitely more into the horror
Mm.
aspect of it. And so the magazine was leaning very horror when I first took it over. And so what
Mm.
I've implemented to make sure that I'm not feeding just my own preferences, that we are actually representing that genre of speculative, which is anything, it's horror, science fiction, and fantasy. We now have a round table. So we have our first readers, and now we have our final readers. As of I think it was the last 2 issues, we started implementing that. And so there's actually a few of us that are picking those final stories. And Gordon Linsner is one of them.
Mm.
And Hildy Silverman is in there as one of them. And then we have Ken Hewler, who is kind of like the editorial assistant. He's our main editor. And then we have, of course, Linda poetry, and Gerard, who is doing our fiction editor. And so then they're picking it. But the stories they took a big shift in 2020, I'll say. And we do avoid things that are blatantly political,
Mm.
but we don't avoid, in fact, we're really embracing the statements that need to be stated, I guess, like say George Orwell's 1984, very speculative, says some very important things that we all need to hear and be aware of. So in the last 3 years, 2 to 3 years, it's the stories that are genre, but more showing how that compares to what we're going through now,
Mm.
and maybe cautionary tales, other insights. We handle issues of race, but usually, like one of the stories that I thought just did this beautifully is Leonard Spicer, and he handled race and disparity through color spectrums. So
Mm.
they were all light waves, and they emoted to each other instead of spoke.
Mm.
And so that's kind of where we go now, is we are really trying to find other ways to express these incredibly important and valuable ideas, that can't really be silenced. There's a lot in a metaphor that you can't find. Um, you can't object to a metaphor, because what are we talking about? We're talking
Mhm.
about color spectrums and light, and
Mhm.
but if you read the story, it's actually talking about a completely different thing. So
Yeah.
we have the best writers. I'm just going to boast, the best writers, the most creative people wind up submitting, and I'm just so proud of that.
Yeah. That's so cool. Have you found, so you have this incredible archive, and have you found that works that were published in the 70s that had some kind of like impossible, that felt like science fiction, are now
Yeah,
no longer science fiction? Basically, like
yeah,
kind of dystopian predictions have now arrived, and we can sort of look at
yeah.
archives to see.
Yeah, definitely. And I actually, I don't know if I mentioned Leonard Spicer, so I'll bring him up again. Leonard Spicer is a technical guy. He was an eBay CEO. I'm absolutely butchering his bio, but I know he worked on eBay as a CEO, and he has invented some things. In fact, he invented the cash system that you use when you go to a cafe and you pay and you
Hmm.
swipe on the that's his. Like, he
Oh.
invented that, or created the tech for it. I guess we don't say invented with tech.
Hmm.
But one of the conversations that we had, because my question was like, why are you here? And why are you submitting a story to this magazine?
Hmm.
And the tech industry and a lot of people right now are looking at science fiction and speculative
Hmm.
with a really keen eye, because what he said was, an engineer can create anything, but if they don't have the idea to create it, they can't create it.
Hmm.
So cell phones, flip phones, are a good example of that. That was a Star Trek thing, and we all thought it was
Mm.
super cool and
Right,
edgy
right,
and like very futuristic. And now nobody would even use a flip phone, because that's so old tech.
right.
But it's because a writer somewhere came up with that idea, and then a all the words of like journalists know, those other mathy people that don't understand, engineers.
Yeah,
An engineer saw that, took the idea, was like, you can actually do that. And so that's where a lot of our innovation comes from now, is fiction. And so
right.
that's why, as this is being realized, it's probably been realized a lot longer than this conversation. But so a lot of that's why you see a resurgence as well in genre fiction right now, because there's a
Yeah,
lot of people that are not necessarily fans of genre fiction looking to see what are we creating. They
yeah,
can create it.
yeah. That's interesting. So what
Yeah.
kind of larger trends are you seeing? I imagine robots, AI, surveillance issues.
Yeah, definitely a lot of issues of freedoms in the last two
Mhm.
issues, which I would think would be this issue, but it's been a couple of issues that we've been worried about that. A lot of issues of like this diaspora, like where are we going as a people? Are we going to
Mm.
Mars, and what would that look like?
Mhm.
Issues of food security. There's been some stories that were really great about food security. We had one issue where the theme was to solve a problem, and that came up with so many. I was actually after that conversation, so it was kind of like, oh well, if you guys are looking at us for ideas of what you can make. Let's give you a bunch of solutions. Here's how we think you could fix things,
Mm.
which I think is where fiction in general thrives. We can create the answers because we have the imagination to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just a lot of stories of I actually have to watch out for this because as an editor in chief and publisher, if you throw a dog and a Molotov cocktail in there, you're already
Mm.
way high on my list. If you're rebelling against something, I'm really going to prefer your story,
Oh,
which is
interesting.
also why we have the round table so that
I thought you
everybody
were going
can
to say
kind of.
those are your pet peeves, but you're saying you like
Oh
those
no,
kind
I
of, yeah,
love those. Yeah,
interesting.
any story that is trying to overthrow the status quo, I really love. I'll say if you're submitting and you kill a dog or any kind of animal cruelty, I'm probably not going to even finish the story. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's just gonna, that's just the way I am. Which
Unless
is
it's
also
with a
why it's great that
Molotov
we have the
cocktail.
round table. Yeah, yeah. Unless you put a melon and the dog is throwing it, then I'm okay with it.
We've traveled back in time. The dog is throwing Molotov cocktail.
Yeah, yeah. We actually did have a story. Somebody heard me say that, and they did a story where people were pets and the dogs were the leaders, and that was such a great story.
Oh
Yes, it
yeah.
made it in, but it was also a really great story.
Yeah.
So, but that's the trends I'm seeing right now are a lot of people are being aware that using fiction is a way to protest things that they're not happy about
Yeah.
in a way that um, is it's a different form of protest than like holding a sign and yelling. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I think it's a more effective, longer lasting form of
Mm.
protest. If
Interesting.
you don't like something, write about it and highlight it and tell us why you think it's not great and what would you do differently. And not only do you have a great story that might be in 1984 that people are talking about forever,
Yeah.
you might actually give somebody an idea to change their minds.
Yeah, it's interesting. It does kind of give a template, like the way 1984, I mean, we're all using it constantly as it gave us the language to talk about
Mm-hmm.
certain things.
Yeah, and to look for things as well.
Mm, yeah.
Like that surveillance, the idea of, Big Brother surveillance.
Hmm.
Um, like maybe we wouldn't look for that if we hadn't been told that in the story.
Right.
Somebody, there's a lot of it's Wired for Story I read, and it's Lisa Cron, really great book, a couple of books that she wrote. But she talks about how we think that reason is the way to talk to people. But actually, if you break it down scientifically, she's a neuroscientist, I believe. It's story, the emotion that connects with the story that really makes us take action.
Mm.
So we can know facts about something, and we're like, yeah, I know smoking causes cancer.
Right.
I shouldn't do it. But then you tell me a story about somebody who was affected by that and how it affected their children and how it affected all the lives around them. And then that might move me to actually stop smoking.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
So I can't remember who it was, but they said it's motion. If you put emotion, it's the E with the motion,
Mm.
so it's what makes us move is the
Yeah.
emotion that is connected to story.
How do you balance then stories that come in that have a great concept and you can see maybe a concept that appeals to, you can see the writers working with these big ideas of resistance and struggle and there's a great idea there. It's very original, but the actual prose is not there. And you need
Yeah,
that,
the
right? Like the prose is the
implementation.
vehicle. If you want to deliver those emotional stories. The prose is the vehicle to do it. But so how do you work with the writer? Do you see that often? How do you handle
Oh
that?
yeah. If it's a really great story and the concept and everything is just brilliant, but the prose isn't there. I'm a book coach for a living. That's actually what pays for everything, or publishing coach specific.
Mhm.
So I'll actually take these stories and ask, because people may not want to be coached as well.
Mhm.
But that's what we wind up doing. If it's just an exceptional story, I'll personally coach them through the writing of it. And it won't make that issue, obviously, but we'll coach through for a future issue.
Mhm.
And many of the stories in the magazine have been either coaching clients that I've had or somebody like that. Like it was just a freebie thing that I was doing because I believed in the story so much.
Mhm.
So, and that's quite a lot of them. There's probably almost one an issue
Mhm.
of a story like that. So, but that's part of the beauty of being able to have this platform is that we can do that. We can look at those stories and work to bring them out. And Ken is really great about working with authors like that as well.
Mhm. Can you talk about how, as an editor, you put different weight on different story elements? So I know,
Mhm,
like when I think of literary fiction, I think the emphasis tends to be more on this broad generalization. I know there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of crossover, but it seems to me the emphasis tends to be more on character psychology, intimate
mhm,
relationships, setting, language. And then with sci-fi or with other genres, it's more on the plot. It's more on action and kind of external events.
mhm.
Again, broad generalization, but can you talk about
Yeah.
what, like, as a reader and as an editor, what do you put the most weight on? Are you looking for like interiority in the characters? Are you looking for something exciting to be happening? Are you looking for high concept?
It is for me, this is like probably the most boring answer in the world, but it's a gut thing for me
Mm,
personally.
yeah.
I'll just read the story, and the most important thing to me is, does it move me? Does
Mm,
it give me any sense of so? And that can be a story heavy on plot. I've had stories because I'm not really a big hardcore science fiction fan,
mm,
but I've had some that just for some reason the emotion was there and it really pushed me to feel different things. And so yeah, that story will make it in. One of my favorites is action wise boring. I mean, I don't want to say it was a boring story. It's a
mm,
great story, but action wise, there's almost no action. It's a robot that's it's shopping with Ida, and I cannot remember who did it, the author's name, but it's a couple issues back, and it's just a robot shopping with an older woman,
mm,
and everything is between the lines. It's very subtle, and I won't give any away any spoilers, but it's basically about the story's about how older people wind up being eclipsed, and we don't
mm,
pay attention to them anymore. And so, and sometimes the other kind of message of that story or moral, if you will, is the most crusty people, the most unpleasant people are often the ones that need that extension of care the most,
mhm.
but we tend to like, oh, you're so rude. And we just leave, we
Yeah.
leave that person around, which just perpetuates the problem. They
Mm,
continue then, their worldview of everybody doesn't like them is then reiterated.
mhm,
And so for me personally, if a story makes the world a better place, and I want to sound all Pollyanna and like
mhm.
we're not hope punk, but if it makes the world a better place, even by pointing out something horrific,
Yeah.
then I really like it. And one of the reasons why I'm so involved with the horror writers is because I feel like horror is a hopeful genre. It teaches
Really?
it role plays how to survive. It gives us resilience. It tells us that monsters can be defeated and helps us face our worst fears, which is why I like it so much. So that's a lot of why I personally
Yeah.
pick a story, which is also why we do have the round table now, the final readers, as well as just it's great to have the original people involved with it still.
Mhm,
We
mhm,
don't want to eclipse them because they're an important part of the family. So like Ken is much more technically oriented. He will actually be looking for plot. I'll be looking for exterior plot, interior plot.
mhm.
Um, where does the story sag? If it doesn't sag, it's definitely a 5 star, and we're going to be looking at it. Um, the the editorial things of like, did you put a knife down in this thing, and now you still have that knife? Little things like
Mm,
that are
yeah.
not going to affect the story. But if it moves you, it can have all of those mistakes, and then that's when we'll work on it further.
Mm,
And I do feel like we're all on the same wavelength with that of trying to make the world a better place with story
mhm. Do
and
you
poetry.
want all the stories to have a kind of hopeful or
Oh
defeating
no,
enemy kind of
no, not
quality?
at all.
Okay.
No, and it also depends on what's going on right now. So in the very beginning, when I took over the magazine, and I'm going to say in my own writing as well, everybody died, always.
Mm,
But we were in a really happy place, I think, as a society.
mm,
So we could have that. And we kind of needed, in my mind, to be reminded that, yeah, bad things happen and there's horrific things. And so don't take everything for granted because it could be taken away like this horror story. And then the world kind of geared towards horror stories being reality. And then it was kind of like, whoa, well, I don't want to add to this. And I feel like I see that a lot with our writers, and I've heard that with other writers too, is horror writers are doing happy endings now
Hmm.
to balance that. Like I wrote my first happy ending mid 2020. I just couldn't. And yeah, there's it's still a horror story. There's blood
Right.
and there's things that happen, but you know, the monster is actually defeated, which was a person, and the I guess murderers or whatever fall in love and walk off happy. And there's like the sunset scene, which I was really shocked about
Yeah.
that ever came out of me. And so that's the other thing. We don't definitely don't want to be hope punk because I have some hope punk friends, publishers. So I'm not saying this, Scott, to you particularly, but I feel like sometimes it can turn into Pollyanna, like we have to make this hopeful and we're going to ignore these things. I do think that it's important to have a balance of, you know, yin and yang, the really dark with there's something really hopeful and joyful. And then there's
Mhm.
also stories that are really negative. So a lot of what goes through the magazine, we talk about the balance of it.
Hmm.
You know, do we have enough of everything for the because the magazine is like the orchestra, and so you've got all these little the string section came up with this great AI story, and the you know the trumpets or the brass section came up with like something really horrifically and classically gothic, but
Mhm.
all together they have to play, and we have to have a tune for that issue that resonates with people that they will enjoy listening to. So that's kind of what we think of it as is, you know, where's the balance and also the right audience, you know, where's the audience with what we're producing, because if they are in a place of extreme gloom and fear,
Hmm.
we don't want to throw gas on that and increase it. We want to then give them some hope. And
Mhm.
so that issue, if there's a lot of stuff going on in the news, that issue, the next issue will be a very positive and happy hope
Hmm.
punky issue. And if there is a lot of happy stuff and we just feel like there's some things that maybe need to be looked at,
Mhm.
then that next issue will be like pretty, yeah, everybody's gonna die. Except the animals.
That's so interesting. So you mentioned audience, which is not, I mean, for the literary magazine counterparts, I think the question of audience is always like, who is the audience? Who's reading?
Mm-hmm.
I actually posted on X the other day because I noticed like almost all genre magazines pay and they don't charge fees. And people, but literary magazines very often don't pay and they do charge fees. And I was curious about this discrepancy. And a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people said, well, it's because the genre magazines have readers and people are subscribing and people are reading. So is that your experience? Do you have a lot? And it's interesting to hear you now talking about like trying to kind of speak directly to your audience with the issues that you
Mm-hmm.
do. So do you have a sense of who your audience is? Do you hear from readers regularly? Do you have a large subscriber base?
Yeah, actually, and I think that's part of space and time that came with it when I took it over was the readers are very clear. It's more of a family. And
Mm,
so usually the readers are also the people that are submitting the stories.
mm,
And so many people have their history, their personal history as a writer just tied up with the history of the magazine. And
mm,
so Gerard Hornier, which is our fiction editor, we actually took his first story. And that meant so much to him at the time that he just kind of stayed on as a fan. We've got people that comb the internet and find tidbits that, you know, obviously we can't know everything over, I think, I don't even know how many years. Since 1966, somebody used a calculator. And they'll suddenly send me an email that says, "Hey, did you know Geordie LaForge or my goodness, I can't remember his real name, but Reading Rainbow guy?
mm.
Yeah, he read a story out of Space and Magazine, Space and Time at this time, and here as it is, and here's the video I found, and there's
Ah,
like they're so excited.
yeah.
So yeah, those are our readers are also the writers that are putting into it, which is also why I think it's super important for us to stay semi-pro.
Hmm.
Even like say sales are going through the roof and we just have tons of money, we'll just start publishing more magazines. You know,
Hmm.
instead of being twice a year right now, we would go to quarterly or then maybe monthly if we had the funds.
Hmm.
Um, they're all people who want to be published, you know, and that is kind of where we have merged or shifted, I guess, with me as the publisher, is it's turned from just fiction to read to be entertained and poetry. into like this issue that's just coming out, the issue that I sent you. We have an interview from Dale L. Roberts, who is I don't know if you know him, but he's kind of like a self-publishing influencer, I guess you could say. He's been around for quite a long time, up there with like Joanna Penn and Orna Ross and the people that have been at the forefront of self-publishing to try to teach people how to do things. And so he's our interview in there because we're trying to, when I realized that our readers were also our submitters,
Mhm.
I started shifting over to try to give them tools to be published more,
Mm.
which kind of aligned with what I was doing. And I wasn't coaching at the time. Well, I was for free. I was a volunteer at the HWA coaching people through story. And then that merged into actually like, oh, wow, this is paying the bills. This is great. Which then kind of fit along when I realized that the readers were actually the people trying to get published as well. Is like, well, let me help you get published.
Mhm.
So a lot of our content isn't just in the magazine. I've got a newsletter, which is 4,000, I think it's like 4,000, which is like, yeah, I mean, it's growing. But they're mostly space and time fans that
Mhm.
came from space and time submissions to that. And we talk about space and time all year long about like what submissions are we looking at based on trends that we're seeing. We'll have interviews with the different people in the magazine. We'll go over little things like shun formatting, people. It like increases your chances so much.
Mm.
And I'll bring up things like, Jonathan Maberry saying he had like 10,000 submissions, and I think that really is the number. It was god awful amount of submissions to something that he was doing, and they could reject. And he said this publicly, so I'm not like telling secrets. He rejected, I think, like all but 100 or something,
Mm.
like very quickly because they weren't in shun formatting. Like they were all
Mm.
misformatted. And when you think of how easy it is to do shun formatting, and that's going to
Mhm.
increase your chances by that much to a really great project. So it's things like that, like really practical things that we can overlook in the beginning
Mhm.
that we try to communicate through the magazine, through all the other channels. And we have a community now. It's a mighty network. It's the Opportunities Hub. And so now we have this real-time community where we're doing open mics, and a lot of the people in the community are winding up in and it's just like this fertile ground, I guess, of creativity. And I
Yeah.
think of movements like Soho, they all came from community. It was a
Mhm.
bunch of people supporting each other creatively. And so
Mhm.
that's kind of what we're trying to build with Space and Time. It's not just a magazine, but a whole universe of support for our readers and anybody else who comes along. You don't have to read Space and Time. We're not going to look down on you because, you don't. But I also think that's why we are tending to list over into the literary side a little more, which the first time somebody said we were a literary magazine, I was kind of like, what? If I'm literary, like, what do you mean? But I can see it now. I can see that direction. So,
Mhm. Mhm. What do you look for? I've mostly asked about the space and time aspect, but what do you look for in horror and what do you tend to see a lot of?
different things that are different that combine genres. I love, like, if you think
Mm.
of like Alien, is that a science fiction or is that horror?
Mhm.
It just kind of bridges that gap. And it's my personal mission to stop having fantasy, science fiction, and horror, but just have it speculative. It's
Mm.
just speculative because it crosses so much. And so that's the favorites in horror is seeing these genre bending, fairy tales that turn horror are big. We've had a couple of those that did really, really well. Science fiction horror does really, really well.
Mm.
Classic gothic, ghost story horror with a twist does really well.
Mm.
So anything that kind of it's just different.
Mhm.
Maybe at one time it would have been sparkly vampires. I don't know, but that's been done. So
Do you have any advice? Because I know people listening to this might have mostly literary, more sort of like realist literary
mhm.
experience. Do you have any advice if somebody wants to step out and branch out into more speculative writing? How do they take those steps? How do they pull it off?
um, I think the number one thing for both, for any writer, is to listen to your authentic voice.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that in the vague way of like, oh, you should, be true to yourself. In a very real way, it's something that I advise all my clients is first know why you're wanting to publish, because it's a different path if you're looking at this for a living, than if you're wanting for, credibility or anything like
Mhm.
that. And then two, take the aspects of you that are very personal to you and then put them in the work and then try to match the genre. So if I have a story about, I'll just do like a very basic example. I have a story about a woman who I want to talk about race problems, and she has a mixed race baby. And that's the story that I want to portray.
Mhm.
But in my real life, I'm part Asian. And so I have that mixed heritage background. I love technical stuff and color change lights, and I'm a gadget geek and I like tattoos. So I might start incorporating those into the story.
Mhm.
And then, and this is my personal strategy, the call is science fiction, or the call is literary, or the call is nonfiction, or whatever the call is. If I want to respond to it, then I match the story or the core of what I'm trying to create with that genre. So if
Oh,
it's
okay,
nonfiction, I'll
interesting.
actually take, okay, I want to talk about this situation, a woman who's having a mixed race baby. And I'm going to put my own personal aspects on it. Like I just did a nonfiction essay about Wes Craven's The Nightmare on Elm Street.
Mhm.
I'm talking about The Nightmare on Elm Street, but the essay is really about my experiences, and yes, I'm admitting this publicly, as a bedwetter from nightmares, that I had, and then how that, and his story was inspired by Asian death syndrome, which
Mhm.
is where you die in your sleep. And so then I tied that into my race. So that's where I took this thing that I wanted to talk about, which was nightmares. And I had this essay that I could do. And then I tied that to that call. And so I write a lot for a specific call. And it's basically, what do I want to write about? I want to talk about this. Where's a call? But it's really any call that's in front of me, because any call, you can sit there and angle it around. The call that's in front of me is how I change whatever I'm wanting to talk about to match that call.
That is so interesting because I think so many writers feel like they're writing what they're writing. Like it
Mhm.
cannot be
Yeah.
I'm just writing something that's true to myself. But it's a really interesting and sort of different approach to say, all right, here's kind of a rough draft, a rough idea of what I'm working on. And now I want to target it to this particular call for this magazine. So
Yeah.
add the
Yeah.
element.
That comes from newspaper background, I think.
Oh, that makes sense.
Writing, I years in the newspaper. And so for me, writing is something I do. I'm fitting it in somewhere,
Right, right.
and but it has to still be what do I want to talk about? How am I going into this?
Mhm.
But then where is the money essentially? But we are talking like not a lot of money, because we are
Yeah,
talking like, magazines and so $50.
yeah. So you're looking for the assignment.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's actually where my best stuff comes from, because if I'm writing just from when I'm writing what I want to write, it's great, but I'm in my rut. I'm in
Mhm.
my lane then. When I'm having to fit what I want to write to somebody else's call, I come up with the most like, oh man, that I could do this, and that's a great idea. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually a story that I'm working on right now. And I guess I can't say all the details about the publisher and everything, but it was basically the same thing. Here's this thing. Do you have anything?
Uh-huh.
And I was kind of like, well, no, but I can always come up with something, especially for something juicy. And so I really had to scramble. Well, one that I can talk about, an example that I can talk about is um, giving the devil his due. I've actually got it right here, and it was a really great call for the Pixel Project. So it was a charity thing, and all the money went towards women who basically female representing, and women that are domestically in danger.
Mhm.
You know, so I mean, I'm trying to word it all correctly and be, correct in how I'm wording it. But they had an emergency and they needed an extra story. And so Regina reached out to me and asked me if I had anything. And I'm kind of like, no, But I do have this old story, this old, really crappy story about a janitor who finds this card, and on the card it's like these people that talk about, like, they're the Injustice League, and they will go take care of your bullies.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I had that, and so I rewrote that story, made it a female protagonist, and that's how I'm changing it to fit the call. It's
Mm-hmm.
now a female protagonist, and it's kind of the same story, but the story it totally changed,
Mm-hmm.
because then it became actually a hopeful story, where originally it was kind of a downer story, but I didn't want to do that to this janitor lady, and so it becomes this hopeful story of empowerment that then she brings onto other women. Like, she gives the Injustice League power card to another woman that she feels like needs it, and so that's kind of what I mean, twisting the thing that I'm going to do anyways
Mm-hmm.
with the call. And then I would have never thought of that in a million years, because the original story was written about a real guy that I knew that was a janitor, and so it was very much in my lane, and it was a little bit gothic, and it was very much um yeah, predictable for me, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But then having to change everything, just that little bit made it a great story. And I think I might be talking out of turn, but I'm pretty sure that that was a Shirley Jackson nomination, not the story, but the book, and it got like a silver audio file. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't really keep track of all that, but like a ton of cool stuff happened with it.
This
So,
is so interesting because it really is, it's a journalistic approach to
mhm,
writing for literary magazines, which
yeah,
yeah, I just haven't heard, again, usually I feel like the method is sort of you write what you write, it comes from you, you make it your very best, and then you find the suitable market for it. And the idea of
yeah,
sort of using a market to kind of inject the work, so you have this idea for a story and then it's a zombie call. So it sort of forces
mhm,
you to maybe step out of your comfort zone a little bit and
yeah,
how can I work zombies into this story?
yeah. Well, and it winds up being just for me, and I'm not
Yeah.
saying, obviously this is always, my perspective, but art is what we create, but when we're trying to market it, we have to think of it as a product. In
Hmm.
my mind, this is how I approach it. So I've had so many stories that I've rewritten to a call, because I'll just write a story because I want to write it.
Yeah.
And so my Google Drive is just teeming. Somebody just asked me if I could pull some of my unpublished short stories together for a collection. And I was like, yeah, let me see what I have. I pulled together 26 stories that have just been sitting there in my files that I'd written at some point because I was super inspired by it. And so that's where a lot of them come from. It's something that I've written, but instead of trying to go solicit that to all the markets, instead I read the markets and I find one that I really want. And usually I'm going to say it's a little bit of a financial thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes my stories are paying for what's in the magazine. I've sold a poem for $50 and then paid poets with that $50.
Mhm.
Um, so it literally, for me, it usually is, oh, there's like a 10 cents a word call for zombies.
Mhm.
What have I got? Well, I do have this story. Yeah, that would actually fit really. And if that was a zombie, man, that would really, how would that change this story?
Right.
And then it goes off into this place that's super, usually unique and, you know, unexpected, because I also didn't expect it,
Right.
Yeah, so I love doing that. And that is
Yeah.
literally where my best work has come from.
That's so interesting. That's a great idea.
Yeah,
So do you
yeah.
only submit to paying markets?
Oh no, not at all. I
Mhm.
do a lot of free stuff. It's really if it just calls to me. I mean,
Mhm.
the money is good, and
Mhm.
money is a nice goal. But it's, like this one, Giving the Devil His Due, that was completely free. Um, I do a lot of free stuff.
Mhm.
A lot of it is if it's just an interesting project, like the
Yeah.
Wes Craven thing. I was kind of, when I was asked, I was like, I remember that movie. Yeah, okay. I've never really, and I just really, weirdly enough, wound up doing two of those. I did an essay on Lamb, that Scandinavian horror, and then on Wes Craven. I've never done any of that before. So that was kind of but that was interesting. And then I remembered stuff about my childhood that I was like, wow, yeah, enlightening.
Interesting. And so where do you
Yeah.
look to find these listings?
Because I have the newsletter, it's Authortunities. It is literally a curated calendar of author opportunities.
Hmm.
So it's just this big list organized by date. And it started as my personal thing, that this is how I organized them. I would just gather interesting
Hmm.
submission calls, but instead of dumping them in a folder where I would lose them and always forget what's coming up, I would organize them by date.
Hmm.
Probably because I kept track of the community calendar in a lot of the newspapers that I was working at. So it's just like an easy extension to do that. And then later that became my newsletter. So each week I wind up looking at about 300 submission calls and picking them out to put them in the newsletter for the next opportunities. So that's where most of them come from for me now.
Hmm.
It used to be like, oh, my friend got published in such and such. I'm going to get published in such and such. But now it's me pasting them in there. And as I'm putting together the newsletter, I'm like, oh, 10 cents a word. That's 20 cents a word. Oh, how much are you paying for it?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I'm setting that in my personal calendar to try to get something for that. So
Interesting.
it does make it easy to find submission calls when you're literally processing submission
Right.
calls for your newsletter.
You are the resource.
Yeah.
That's great. So going back to the magazine, are there specific things that you are looking for? There are maybe many writers hearing this and they're getting excited. Anything in particular that you want to say you are actively seeking for the journal?
Yeah. It's for the last probably couple of years since 2020. We've really been looking for stories that very much change, they could elicit change in people.
Mhm.
So stories that highlight social problems that we have in a different way, in a way that somebody might listen to it. Because you could say something to somebody in that factual way, but we want our writers to emotionally tell us why we should change and think something differently. So that has been a lot of them. As I'm looking through these, one of my favorites from this issue that has just now come out is Use Sleep by Richard Dansky.
Mhm.
And I guess I don't want to do any plot spoilers, but he basically talks about addiction, but with sleep. But then also like how how we how we can put ourselves in debt for our pleasures today, in a very real way. And it's a just a like that's one of the ones that like every submission call there'll be one or two that I just can't forget.
Mhm.
Shopping with Ida was one. Use Sleep is going to reside in my head forever, probably. And I think of it as like the Shirley Jackson story, The Lottery. It's just something you don't forget. It's
Mhm.
something that you don't know even what makes it so special, but it tied in with that emotion and you can't forget it. So those are the stories that we're looking for.
Yeah.
And I'm just really proud we actually get a lot of them.
Mhm.
It's not like a one issue per thing. It's usually 20, and then we have to hone it down from that 20 to 5-ish. So
Yeah. And when you say stories that elicit change, I'm assuming you don't mean like in a didactic sense, like it's very clear where the writer's sort of
yeah,
telling
yeah,
you.
very. Yeah, it's more like, so maybe more accurately would be to present another perspective,
Hmm.
another way to think, because that's something that we're kind of big on is, space and time has no boundaries.
Yeah.
So we want our readers to, and I think we do attract these readers to be free thinkers that could imagine light being
Mhm.
alive and having a whole society and emoting to each other instead of speaking, you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, really anything I want to say the weirder it is too, the weirder it is, as long as it's communicating. And that is like, I guess the operative thing, it must communicate.
Yeah.
Just can't be weird for weirdness sake, but as long as it's communicating something, and if we initially all read it and go, what the hell? That's a good sign.
Yeah.
And then we had one like that this issue, and I don't think it made it in, but then Kim's response was, okay, I'm really wondering what's going on with this. So I tagged it so Angela can have a second look. And I'm
Yeah.
like,
Well, I imagine
and then
it's
I
a
read it
great
and go, yeah.
sign. Yeah, because you, I would think, have seen a lot of weird stuff. So if you can still be sort of weirded out by a story, I think that's a great sign.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're actually not very huge on gore, despite
Mm.
my horror leanings. It is more of the there's all kinds of ways to be horrified
Yeah.
in very real ways, without like, somebody coming along with a stabby stab, though
Mhm.
sometimes that's fits the bill.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just need some stabby stab.
So this has been great. I have one final
Yeah.
question, and this is a question I ask all editors. And you've sort of answered this to some degree already, but I'm just curious what keeps you motivated, what keeps you inspired to do this work. I know you've had, global supply chain issues and financial setbacks, and so at the end of the day, what keeps you motivated to keep running this lit mag?
Publishing these voices,
Mhm.
how much it means. I've never forgotten how important it was to me when I got that first professional sale. And not that we're even doing professional, so I'll say any sale. The
Mhm.
first time somebody paid me money for my fiction or my poetry, was huge. It was
Yeah.
such a feeling of joy, and it meant so much to me. And I could have been having a really crappy life, but that would have made the difference to me, and that
Yeah.
would have kept me going for like a month. And so that is why we try to fit in. We do tend to go for shorter stories so we can fit more voices in.
Mhm.
But it is seriously just that, just knowing that our yes could make like a huge difference to somebody and change the
Yeah.
trajectory of their life. Like
Yeah.
Gerard didn't know he was going to be enslaved to be a fiction editor forever, by just getting that one yes. But
He was
but it's
trapped.
been a huge thing for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you, Angela. This has been just delightful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank